Welcome back, everybody. How y'all doing? Lovely. Today we are going to return to the app we were building last class, and where we left off was actually a relatively complicated section. So we're going to revisit that a little bit. We're going to do a bit of refactoring because what I realized is that I gave you some false information, and many of you have confirmed that the homework was impossible to do without knowing a few extra pieces. So let's go over that really quickly, and then we'll talk about what we can do about it. And actually we'll integrate a little bit of like new era JavaScript, which is fun because it's the future, and I like the future. So let's talk about it. The first thing, actually I'm just going to get rid of this preview here really quickly. I'm going to pop in a new screen. Cool, lovely. This all looks good. Let's go ahead and come back here. Let's get rid of this little guy right there. Last time we were writing some functions in the Firebase section, and I've actually commented them back out. This get user sent messages and get user received messages. I think I spelled that wrong. I before E except ever C. I think it's like received. Is that actually how I spell that? Whatever. You know what? I'm not going to deal with it right now. We'll come back to it later. Spelling is just not my forte. I apologize. That's why they invented spell check to begin with. But one of the things you might have noticed is that if you run these functions, for instance, say you were to take both of these functions right here, which are going to get the user sent and received messages in Firebase. That means that in the database right here, in our Firebase database, when you look at all the messages, every message has a recipient field and a sender field, and each one of those corresponds to an ID of the users who are actually using the app. There's actually another way to do that, by the way, without getting super complicated here. You can add one of these, and you could say the type, and you can actually point to a reference to another document. So you could say like collection users and to that user itself. There's another way to do this, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm sticking with the method we have right here. But one of the things you might have noticed is that if you try to do this, if you try to run this function, as soon as you click on one of the users right here, you'll see that everything loads fine. But you see all these errors right here, and that says the query requires an index. And this is actually referring to this part right here. When you try to order each query by a specific field, you're going to notice that you're going to get errors that it means it requires an index. So let's go ahead and comment that out and see if that's still okay. But when we do that, let's just console.log all the snapshots. We'll just say snapshot for each doc. We will console.log the doc.data, just like to kind of see what's going on inside it. And so if you do this, cool, and I console log it here, I see no errors. Notice that? Nothing goes wrong yet. And if I click on one of these users right here, you'll notice that again, it says displaying text from each of these individuals, but none of the queries actually fire off. I don't get any errors this time, and it was this order by timestamp descending error that comes when I call both of these functions here. The order by timestamp descending that threw that error. So we're actually going to do a couple things here that's going to fix this, and I'm going to show you a fun new way to actually make all of our messages actually display in this conversation list. So the first thing we want to do is we just want to clear up how we're getting messages into the database in Firebase. And so the way we're doing that is right up here. Whenever we click the send button, we are submitting the text message with the text in the input. And so the submit text button is in the Firebase.js. It's right here. And the other thing we're doing wrong, by the way, is we're using a new date, which just creates a string, and we're actually going to change that in a second, excuse me, as well. But for the time being, you should at least just know what it is we're doing here. So all this is fine, but we're going to update it in a second to make this look a little nicer. Is that cool with everybody? So you all know what we're doing? Okay, perfect. Let's do it then. The first thing we're going to do is, if you haven't heard of ES6, I just want to make this super clear about what's happened in the world of JavaScript recently. JavaScript is continuously changing, and one of the things that people are constantly trying to handle is how we do these .thens. When something happens, then we have to go query a database or hit an API. something that takes essentially a longer period of time than our code is able to handle before it executes. This is known as asynchronous JavaScript. And asynchronous JavaScript has been handled a bunch of different ways previously, through callbacks, recently through promises, and all kinds of other things. But I'm going to show you the newest, and I still think the best way to handle asynchronous JavaScript, and we're going to do it actually in this getUserSentMessages function. But first, let's go ahead and send a couple messages so we can make sure everything is working. So to do that, I'm going to send one here that says, "This is a new message." And I'm going to click the send button. Have you noticed also that this is not a really fun way to do this? We have to come over here. I can hit enter and nothing is going to happen. We can actually change that up as well. Do you want to change that first? Okay. Cool, let's do that first then. That's actually a pretty easy fix. In the UI, you see how we have this send button event listener? We can actually attach an event listener to the entire document itself by doing this. We can say document.add event listener, and we can wait for a key press. And when a key presses, we'll take that event and we'll pass it to this callback function. We'll say const key equals e.which or e.keycode. Don't worry about why, just go ahead and do it for now. We'll talk in a little bit. And we'll say if that key is equal to 13, and by the way, in case you're curious, 13 is the enter key. Oops, enter key. If the key is equal to 13, then we will do the exact same thing we did here. We'll take this whole thing and we'll just submit the text like we normally would. And so now either of these two things will work. And this will just actually make our lives a lot easier. So if I save this and I come over here and I hit another message, yay, and I hit enter, oh, look at that. And we send the message. Cool. And just to make sure that works, we check Firebase, and there's two new messages. One that says this is a new message, and one that says another message, yay. So seems like everything is working. And I apologize for that quick detour. Let's go back to this section here and talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing. So both of these functions here, the getUserSentMessages and getUserReceivedMessages, when we click on each of these, it displays the user, and we can actually see these messages in the screen. It actually went to go get the messages from the database, it queries the database, and we console.log them. That's really cool, that's nice. But right now we don't see them here, and there's a couple ways to handle this. I'm first going to walk you through like the not as good way, but the way that works, and then we're going to do the better way. But both of those are going to involve some asynchronous JavaScript. So let's talk about this asynchronous JavaScript that we're about to do. Are you ready? Okay. The first thing is if you know a function is going to be asynchronous, and what I mean by asynchronous is if you know that it is going to have to go do something, and then it's going to take a long time, like query the database, you can just call it an async function like this. Async function getUserSentMessages. And by calling it an async function, you see there's no errors. We just put this async word, keyword, in front of the word function. Let's do that for both of these because they're both asynchronous. So both of these async activities allow us to do a lot of cool stuff. And the first thing it allows us to do is we can just keep this right here, this const query equals database.collection messages dot where the sender is the user, whoever the currently logged in user is, and where the recipient is whoever the person we're currently talking to is. And then we don't have to get them yet. What we can do is something like this. We can say const snapshot equals query.get, just like that. So we don't even have to attach that dot then to the end of it. We can just throw this together. Cool, cool. And what will happen here is if we put this keyword await in front of query.get, none of the code below line 117 inside this function will execute until the data from query.get is passed back into snapshot. So it awaits that data, and this await keyword is only used when we have this async keyword in front of the function call, or defining the function, excuse me. So that's cool. And then what we can actually do is we can just do what we normally do inside asynchronous calls, which we can say is like if the snapshot.size, if there is something in the snapshot, let's actually do something different. Let's return all of the data. Let's have this data be returned back to the UI function call down here where we call this. Let's say, let's do something. Ooh, you know what let's do? Let's go ahead and say that this also should be an asynchronous function. Update UI, that it should happen asynchronously. And I'm going to show you a bunch of cool new ES6 tricks at the same time. And so I think an easy way to do this is to say exactly what we did here, current user ID equals auth.currentUserID. But let's also say that, let's use some ES6 destructuring. And so what ES6 destructuring is this user info looks like this. This is the user info. It has an ID key and a name key. We can actually just do this, which pulls out that ID and name key and uses them as variables, storing the UID and the username in both of those variables. It's called object destructuring, and it's just a really simple way to not have to constantly write const ID equals userinfo.id. Const name equals userinfo.name. You can just write it all in one line like this. And so that's just a simpler, easier way. And so by doing this, we can then get the ID and the name, and then we can come down here and call these functions. We could say const sent messages equals await get user sent messages, and const received messages, I'm spelling this all different kinds of ways, I'm so bad at this, equals await get user. Look at how I spell. Oh, man, I am not good. I should be consistent here, and I actually don't know the right way to spell received. Let me find out really quickly. Received. Yeah, that looks right. It starts with an E, I guess. Cool. So let's go ahead and fix that here, because otherwise I'm going to run into some errors. Or I'm just going to feel bad about it. Okay, cool. That seems nice. But I haven't updated this one here yet. And I actually haven't finished that other function either. But just to make sure they work, we're going to console.log them. Cool? Console.log sent messages are the, let's just say json.stringify, so we can turn this data structure into a nice little JSON object. Sent messages. Let's do the same thing, but for received messages. And so if we do this, if we use these asynchronous await, async await calls, we can do all kinds of cool things. And so I'm going to call this ID, and I'm going to call this name for simplification. We're going to save this. We're going to come into our firebase.js file over here, and we're going to return this whole thing. We're going to say snapshot.docs.map each doc, and then we're just going to return an array of the data from each document. And so if we do this, we can replace this, and we can use this ES6 function here to return this whole thing. But if there's nothing there, let's just return an empty array. And so this will actually work for both of these. We can just then erase this one here and just copy the exact same code. Now you might be noticing, by the way, that both of these functions are relatively similar. They are. And we could combine them into one function and get clever, but for the sake of clarity, I'm just going to do it like this for the time being. And so now, if we come back here, let's just make sure we have no errors. We have no errors, and look, here's all the sent messages, and the received messages are empty. And so this asynchronous JavaScript is working exactly as we expected it to. And so that is actually an easier way to do this. Not necessarily easier, but a more intuitive way to deal with asynchronous JavaScript. So hopefully I've taught you a little bit of extra stuff, but this is a long video, so we'll stop it here. I'll slack out the code, and then we'll talk about it in a second.